Gunfire rang out across parts of Goma, the largest city in eastern Congo, just hours after a Rwanda-backed rebels said they had seized the city. The recent advance by the M23 rebel alliance has forced thousands in Congo's mineral-rich east from their homes. The claim came minutes before a 48-hour deadline it had given to Congolese troops to surrender their weapons expired. The DRC government said their advance was a declaration of war by Rwanda. M23 rebels have been locked in a conflict with the Congolese army and UN peacekeepers on Goma's outskirts for several days. Hours after the troops entered the city, a mass jailbreak took place at a prison which holds around 3,000 inmates. It was totally torched following the jailbreak that resulted in deaths, as per security. This came despite the United Nations Security Council calling for an end to the offensive. Earlier today, buses were standing by, ready to evacuate United Nations staff and their families from the besieged Congolese city. Kenya's President William Ruto announced an extraordinary East Africa Community Summit within the next 48 hours to discuss the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ruto said that both Rwanda's Paul Kagame and DRC's Felix Tshisekedi will take part in the summit. The battle for the key city is the latest chapter of fighting in the eastern DRC, a volatile area that has struggled with regional rivalries, ethnic disputes and armed militia conflicts for more than 3 decades, triggering one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. With us to discuss this is Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, former diplomat. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Kapoor. I want to know about the strategic value of Goma specifically and why it matters so much that this M23 group have targeted it.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad you have brought up this for discussion because large part of Africa has been sought after by the forces of various countries over the different decades in the last century for their mineral wealth primarily and other resources. Now the eastern part of Congo borders Rwanda, and Rwanda is trying to have its influence expanded on that zone, which is also very mineral rich. There are UN peacekeeping forces which are trying to enforce the peace but have not been very successful. They had managed to get the surrender of quite a few militants earlier who had surrendered their weapons, but again they have regrouped, and with active support from the Rwandan army, war has again broken out in that area. Kenya is trying to broker peace. The militants are known as M23 group, which is March 23. It's a complicated situation. It's going to take some time to get resolved. The UN chief is very concerned also, and there are demands in the United Nations to impose sanctions on Rwanda to bring this to a closure at the earliest possible, because 13 US soldiers have died, mostly from South Africa, some from Malawi, and including one from Uruguay. So there is a lot of international concern at this sudden outbreak of violence, and this is in the province of Kivu. Goma is the capital. It is very near the border with Rwanda, so it's very easy for Rwanda to send its troops in. It's denying that it is doing anything there, but the reports from the ground suggest that they are actively supporting the militants of M23 and creating more disruptions there. So the international community has to see how to bring this to a successful closure at the earliest possible.
Ambassador Kapoor, apologies for the interruption, but this is a conflict that isn't spoken about that much in the mainstream media, much like other African conflicts. What is going on specifically that affects the daily lives of those in the Congo right now, specifically in Goma?
Well, unfortunately, a large part of the difficulties of Africa do not find mention in the mainstream narrative in other parts of the world and in the Western world, because they do not directly impact the daily life of the citizen in those countries. But it does impact very significantly the people living there in those areas, because their lives are turned upside down. Their possibilities of continuing in a peaceful manner to earn their livelihoods gets totally disrupted. So it's very important for the world to also give some time and attention to these very serious problems which are existing in one part of Africa or the other. Traditionally, it has been the case that most of the world continues to ignore these problems and look the other way and let things happen, or actively participate, like in the case of Belgium for the diamonds there, or France, or the US forces, or even Russia's Wagner troops. So many countries have been sending their, armed forces, fully equipped and armed, to try to support one side or the other to get access to the rich mineral resources of Africa, not bothering about the lives of the citizens in those areas. And that is why it is also, tainted, very tainted effort in terms of blood money, blood diamonds, etc., which reach the Western world, the Western consumers, uh, through these intervention of these forces, which is completely contrary to the respect which those people in those areas are entitled to, and the dignity of life that they are entitled to.
Ambassador Kapoor, obviously we have had news of other regional East Africa countries, specifically Kenya's president, speaking out about this and calling for an emergency summit. What are the outcomes that we might be able to expect from this, if any?
Well, I think that is a very good effort, because if the African countries get together and keep on speaking out loud and try to make efforts, like Kenya is making, the president of Kenya, Ruto, he has been trying to get both these countries together, Rwanda and Congo, the heads of these countries, to a sort of a meeting in Kenya, so that they can thrash out the differences and not continue with this violence which has erupted in the eastern province of Congo. But that effort has to become an all Africa continent effort through the Organization of African Unity, for example, the OAS, for example. They have to get together. South Africa has to speak out. Nigeria has to speak out and support Kenya's efforts. So once you have the big countries of Africa speaking out, and because South Africa's troops have also been killed in significant numbers, that's the biggest contingent which has suffered the maximum casualties. I think 9 South African soldiers have died, and maybe 3 Malawian soldiers and 1 Uruguayan soldier. So all these countries who have a vested interest in keeping the peace there and in maintaining the focus on development, they have to get together. They have to bring these issues in the United Nations and make sure that these issues are resolved either on a pan-African basis or at the UN Security Council, with sanctions on the country which is creating all the disruptions. Thank you.
Ambassador Kapoor, one last question. How, for those that don't know, there are certain accusations between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. How, I was wondering if you could quickly explain those to people who don't know, and how do these accusations complicate the prospects of peace?
So, I have been actively involved with Africa since the mid-80s, when I was looking after East Africa, and then I got posted. I was working on an assignment out of Tanzania for about 4 years, so I had possibilities to tour a large portion of the continent extensively and understand the region. Now here in Congo, the border between Rwanda and Congo is quite big, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which it is called, while Kinshasa, the capital, is on the western extreme. On the eastern extreme, the border exists between Rwanda and Congo. Rwanda falls almost within the East Asian side, but Central Africa. So both these countries have a shared border, and they have a lot of minerals in that area. Now, the people of Goma, the people of Goma, which is the capital of Kivu province, they are the ones who are suffering the most in this process, because Rwanda has sent its soldiers to support the militants so that it can lay a claim on the mineral riches in Kivu province and secure them for their own purpose and for their own benefit, and depriving the Congolese people from getting the benefit of those minerals. So that is why there is war. The M23, what happens in these wars is that there is some militants or some rebel forces which are trying to establish their hegemony or supremacy in that part of the world, because they know that the mineral riches are very profitable for exploitation by any country. So they will come into an agreement with foreign forces, whether they are forces of the Western countries, like I mentioned earlier, or with local forces of some other country, like Rwanda in this case, that if Rwandan army supports us, we will give them so many millions of dollars worth of access to these mineral resources. So Rwanda will then say, okay, we are sending in 5,000 soldiers, or we'll send in 10,000 soldiers. Now that sort of number in Africa is a very significant number for a province, because for the DR Congo to combat the militants who are homegrown militants of M23, combined with the strength of these Rwandan forces, becomes more and more difficult. So the province itself gets totally war zone, becomes a war zone, gets totally disrupted. The daily life gets disrupted. The education gets disrupted. The livelihoods get disrupted. The economic, all the activities get disrupted. So what happens is, just for the sake of getting your hands onto those mineral-rich, areas of Eastern Congo, you have Rwanda interfering and trying to lay its claim on that through the agency of the M23 militants and rebels. And that is what is currently happening in that part of Kivu. And that is what the international community also needs to try to see how to resolve it at the earliest possible, so that the invasion of the eastern province by the Rwandan forces is halted immediately. The UN peacekeeping forces are able to carry out their role without their soldiers getting killed, which is a very great tragedy, because the blue helmets are there to keep the peace. They are not there to fight any army or to fight other militants. They are there to prevent the militants from creating havoc, creating chaos, and creating violence.
Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, thank you very much for joining us.